By the spring of 1945, the Allied victory over Nazi Germany was no longer in doubt. Berlin was surrounded. German resistance was collapsing. Yet behind the public image of unity and celebration, fear was already replacing relief inside Western command rooms. The enemy that had justified the Grand Alliance was dying. Another power was rising in its place. That power was the Soviet Union. For much of the war, Allied leaders had deliberately ignored warning signs. They had to. Without Soviet manpower, Germany could not be defeated. The Red Army was absorbing catastrophic losses while grinding the Wehrmacht into ruin. Questioning Soviet intentions too early would have fractured the alliance and prolonged the war. So concerns were postponed, not resolved. By 1945, postponement was no longer possible. The Red Army did not behave like a force preparing to demobilize. As German resistance collapsed, Soviet formations continued advancing, consolidating, and restructuring. Intelligence officers observed something unsettling. Soviet logistics did not slow down after victory. Supply depots expanded. Rail lines were reinforced. Command structures hardened. This was not the behavior of an army preparing to go home. Western intelligence began mapping Soviet-controlled territory and quickly realized how far reality had diverged from wartime agreements. Eastern Europe was no longer contested ground. It was being absorbed. Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and much of eastern Germany fell under Soviet military control far beyond what had been publicly negotiated. Provisional governments were installed under Red Army protection. Opposition figures disappeared. Local resistance was crushed before it could organize. This expansion was not chaotic. It was systematic. British and American intelligence reports documented mass arrests of non-communist leaders, forced political realignments, and the rapid construction of security services modeled directly on Soviet internal control structures. These were not emergency measures. They were foundations. The West had expected influence. The Soviets were building permanence. At the center of this realization was Winston Churchill. Unlike many American officials still focused on demobilization and public relief, Churchill viewed geopolitics as continuous conflict. To him, victory over Germany merely removed one variable. The balance of power still existed, and that balance was shifting dangerously eastward. Churchill's private correspondence from this period reveals mounting alarm. He believed the Soviet Union intended to dominate Europe not temporarily, but structurally. The Red Army's position allowed it to impose facts on the ground faster than diplomacy could respond. Once Soviet forces were entrenched, removing them without war would be impossible. The numbers were stark. By mid-1945, the Red Army fielded millions of experienced troops in Europe alone. Allied ground forces, exhausted and politically pressured to demobilize, were shrinking. British planners calculated that Soviet manpower outnumbered Western forces by ratios that made conventional deterrence meaningless. Even with American industrial power, a sudden Soviet offensive would be difficult to stop. Air power offered limited reassurance. While the Allies dominated the skies, intelligence assessments concluded that air superiority alone could not halt massed ground advances across Central Europe. The terrain favored the defender once momentum was achieved, and the Soviets had momentum. More troubling was Soviet behavior during diplomatic engagements. Repeated Allied protests over Eastern Europe were ignored or delayed. Promises were made, then quietly broken. Stalin's negotiators spoke the language of cooperation, while Soviet forces acted unilaterally. Intelligence analysts began noting a pattern. Soviet diplomacy functioned primarily as cover for irreversible military facts. By the time Germany surrendered, this pattern was undeniable. What terrified Western planners most was not Soviet hostility, but Soviet patience. There was no immediate aggression toward the West. No overt threat, just steady consolidation. Intelligence warned that this made the situation more dangerous, not less. A sudden strike was unlikely. A slow encirclement was far more probable. The Allies had also misjudged Soviet psychology. They assumed exhaustion. The Soviet Union had lost tens of millions. Cities lay in ruins. Logic suggested retrenchment, but intelligence reports contradicted this assumption. Soviet leadership framed victory as validation, not closure. The war had proven their system could survive anything. That belief encouraged expansion, not restraint. In British war rooms, planners began asking questions they had avoided for years. What if the Soviet Union never intended to leave Eastern Europe? What if Allied demobilization created an irreversible imbalance? What if the next war began before the last one had truly ended? These were not academic concerns. They were strategic nightmares. Churchill, in particular, feared a moment of vulnerability. Once American public opinion demanded rapid troop withdrawals, the West would lose leverage permanently. Any attempt to confront the Soviets later would be far costlier, perhaps impossible, without catastrophic war. The alliance that had defeated Germany now concealed a fatal asymmetry. One side was preparing for peace. The other was preparing for control. And that realization led directly to a decision that would remain secret for decades. Because if diplomacy failed, and intelligence suggested it might, the West needed to know one thing above all else. Could the Soviet Union be stopped? Before we continue into the classified planning phase, make sure you subscribe to WW2 Declassified. This channel exists to uncover what governments planned, feared, and buried, using real documents, not myths. The decision to study war against the Soviet Union did not emerge from a committee debate or a prolonged policy review. It came from one man operating in private, at a moment when the public believed the world was finally at peace. In May 1945, only days after Germany's unconditional surrender, Winston Churchill issued a classified instruction to the British Chiefs of Staff Committee. The language was careful. The implications were not. He asked them to examine what would happen if the Western Allies were forced into war with the Soviet Union. This was not framed as a distant contingency. It was not a theoretical exercise for future generations. Churchill wanted answers immediately. He wanted force ratios, timelines, vulnerabilities, and outcomes. He wanted to know whether the Red Army could be stopped if diplomacy collapsed. The directive was given absolute secrecy. No announcement was made. No parliamentary discussion occurred. No Allied press briefing hinted at it. Even many senior officers were unaware the study existed. Those who were informed understood instantly why. The political consequences of exposure would have been catastrophic. Planning war against a wartime ally while victory celebrations were still ongoing would have shattered public trust. Churchill understood this risk. He accepted it anyway. The Chiefs of Staff treated the directive with total seriousness. This was not dismissed as speculation or personal paranoia. They assigned planners, requested intelligence estimates, and began assembling data from across Europe. The study was given a code name that captured its political volatility: Operation Unthinkable. The stated objective, written plainly in internal documents, was chilling in its clarity: to impose the will of the United States and the British Empire upon the Soviet Union. There was no euphemism, no defensive framing. The planners understood that if war came, it would be initiated by the West. This alone made the plan explosive. The assumed start date was July 1st, 1945, barely 2 months after the end of World War II in Europe. Allied forces would not have time to fully demobilize. Soviet forces would still be concentrated, alert, and experienced. Surprise was essential. Without it, the planners believed the operation would fail almost immediately. Crucially, Churchill's order assumed American participation. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Operation Unthinkable. While the study was commissioned by Britain, it was built around the assumption that U.S. forces would fight alongside British and Commonwealth troops. Whether American political leadership fully understood or endorsed this assumption at the time remains deeply ambiguous. What is clear is that the planners did not believe Britain could act alone. The chiefs of staff quickly recognized the magnitude of what they were being asked to evaluate. They were not planning a limited intervention or a show of force. They were planning a full-scale continental war against the largest land army on Earth. Intelligence inputs flooded in. Soviet troop strength estimates were revised upward repeatedly. Red Army formations were counted not just by number, but by experience. These were not raw recruits. They were hardened veterans who had survived the most brutal fighting in history. Their commanders had learned fast, adapted quickly, and showed little hesitation in absorbing losses. Western planners also assessed morale. Contrary to assumptions, intelligence suggested Soviet troops were not demoralized by years of war. Victory had strengthened cohesion. The narrative inside the Soviet system framed the Red Army as liberators, not occupiers. This ideological confidence mattered. It meant resistance would be fierce. The chiefs of staff understood that Churchill's directive placed them in an impossible position. They could not refuse the study. They could not soften the results. Their duty was to provide an honest military assessment, regardless of political discomfort. And the more data they gathered, the more alarming the picture became. They also recognized the political isolation of the order. Churchill was acting ahead of consensus. American public opinion was already turning inward. The war against Japan still demanded attention. Britain was exhausted economically and socially. The electorate wanted peace, not another existential struggle. Yet Churchill pressed on. His fear was temporal. He believed there was a narrow window when Western forces still had leverage. Once demobilization began in earnest, once Soviet control solidified in Eastern Europe, that window would slam shut. Operation Unthinkable was not born of optimism. It was born of desperation. The chiefs of staff worked in silence, fully aware that the conclusions they reached might never be acted upon and might never be forgiven if revealed. They understood that history, if it ever learned of this study, would judge it harshly or not at all. But they also understood something else. If they did not answer Churchill's question honestly and war came anyway, the cost would be immeasurable. So they continued, mapping, calculating, predicting. Preparing for a war the world was not supposed to know had ever been considered. When the British chiefs of staff finally began translating Churchill's fears into operational reality, the first thing they did was remove politics from the equation. Operation Unthinkable was not written as a speech or a warning. It was written as a war plan, cold, mechanical, unforgiving. The planners began with geography. Europe in mid-1945 was not an abstract map. It was a battlefield, still littered with men, fuel depots, railheads, bridges, and exhausted divisions. Any new war would not begin on a blank slate. It would erupt directly out of the ruins of the last one. The critical line was the Elbe River. This was not symbolic. It was practical. The Elbe marked the deepest point of Allied ground penetration into Germany. East of it stood the Red Army, massive, concentrated, and already dug in. West of it stood American and British forces preparing to demobilize. The planners understood immediately that whoever controlled the Elbe corridor controlled the opening phase of any war. Operation Unthinkable assumed a surprise Allied offensive beginning along the Elbe-Dresden axis. The objective was not territorial conquest, it was disruption. The Allies would attempt to fracture Soviet frontline cohesion before the Red Army could reorganize into full defensive depth. This assumption was brutally optimistic. British war planners were under no illusions about parity. Every early draft acknowledged that Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming. In infantry alone, the Red Army outnumbered Western ground forces by millions. Even worse, those troops were concentrated in Europe, while Allied reinforcements would require oceanic transport and political approval. Maps drawn for Operation Unthinkable reveal a grim expectation. They show Allied advances penetrating briefly into Soviet-held territory, followed almost immediately by massive counteroffensives. Planners predicted that initial gains would be shallow, costly, and likely temporary. The goal was not victory. It was survival long enough to force negotiations. Air power featured prominently in the planning, but with strict limitations. The Allies dominated the air in 1945. That advantage was real, but intelligence assessments warned against overconfidence. Soviet air defenses had improved dramatically since 1941. More importantly, air power could disrupt movement, but not annihilate massed ground forces without sustained bombing campaigns that would devastate civilian populations. The planners were explicit. Air superiority would not win this war. Naval power was even less relevant. Once the war moved inland, naval dominance meant little. The Red Army did not rely on sea lines for its core strength. The conflict would be decided on railways, roads, and fields already soaked in blood. One of the most sobering elements of the plan was logistics. British analysts compared Allied supply chains to Soviet ones and reached a terrifying conclusion. The Soviet Union held a logistical advantage inside Europe. Its troops were closer to supply sources. Its rail networks were already oriented east-west. Its commanders were accustomed to operating with minimal support. The Allies, by contrast, would be fighting at the end of extended supply lines while simultaneously demobilizing under public pressure. Every additional day of fighting would weaken the West faster than the Soviets. The planners also modeled morale. Western troops had fought for years under the promise that victory meant home. Reversing that expectation, ordering men to fight a former ally immediately after defeating Germany, was considered a severe psychological risk. Soviet troops, by contrast, would be told they were defending the gains of the Great Patriotic War. Intelligence assessments suggested this narrative would be effective. Perhaps the most disturbing section of the planning documents involved time. If Operation Unthinkable failed to achieve decisive disruption within weeks, the planners believed the war would become unwinnable. The longer it lasted, the more Soviet numerical advantage would dominate. Industrial output, manpower replacement, and political will all favored the USSR in a prolonged conflict. This led to a conclusion few expected to write down. Even with surprise, even with air superiority, even with American participation, the chiefs of staff believed the Allies were unlikely to win a sustained land war against the Soviet Union in 1945. That sentence appears in various forms across drafts. Not impossible, not hopeless, but highly unlikely. The maps reflected this realism. They did not show triumphant arrows sweeping east. They showed stalled fronts, encirclements, retreats, defensive lines creeping westward. Worst-case scenarios included Soviet breakthroughs toward the North Sea and the Mediterranean. This was not propaganda. It was honest planning. The chiefs of staff understood something crucial. Once war began, escalation would be automatic. There would be no limited engagement, no clean exit. Europe would burn again, this time without the moral clarity of fighting Nazism. One detail stands out above all others. Atomic weapons were not assumed to be decisive. In mid-1945, the atomic bomb existed only as a theoretical advantage. It had not yet been demonstrated. Its deployment against Soviet forces in Europe was uncertain politically, logistically, and morally. Planners could not build a war plan around a weapon whose effects were still unknown. Operation Unthinkable was therefore conceived as a conventional war. That alone made it terrifying. By the time the maps were finalized, the planners had answered Churchill's question honestly. Yes, war was possible. Yes, it could be initiated. No, it would not end well. And that led directly to the most explosive part of the entire plan. Because if the Allies could not match Soviet manpower, they would need to find it elsewhere. By the time the British Chiefs of Staff reached the midpoint of Operation Unthinkable, the planners faced a reality they could no longer evade. No amount of optimism, air power, or clever maneuver could erase the basic imbalance staring back from their own maps. The Red Army had the numbers, the Red Army had the momentum, and the Red Army had Europe. If the Allies intended to confront the Soviet Union on land in 1945, they needed manpower they did not possess. That realization led to the most explosive, morally radioactive section of the entire plan. The German question. Only weeks earlier, Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Its crimes were still being uncovered. Concentration camps were still being liberated. War crimes investigations were only beginning. Publicly, the Allied position was absolute. Germany was defeated, disarmed, and permanently neutralized. Privately, British planners were forced to ask a question that would never appear in a press briefing. What if German soldiers were the only force capable of balancing Soviet manpower? This was not a rhetorical exercise. It appears explicitly in the planning annexes. The Chiefs of Staff identified one brutal fact. Millions of former German soldiers still existed. They were trained, they were experienced, and critically, they had spent years fighting the Soviet Union. No Allied force understood Red Army tactics better. The plan did not envision a revived German army marching under its own flag. That would have been politically impossible. Instead, it considered the controlled rearming of selected former Wehrmacht units under strict Allied supervision. The proposal was buried deep in classified appendices. Even within the Chiefs of Staff, access was limited. This was not because the idea was unrealistic. It was because it was morally indefensible in public. Rearming Germans weeks after defeating Nazism would have shattered Allied legitimacy. It would have confirmed every Soviet accusation of Western hypocrisy. It would have enraged war-weary populations across Britain and America. Yet militarily, the logic was undeniable. German formations had fought the Red Army longer than anyone. They understood Soviet doctrine, strengths, and weaknesses. They knew how Soviet armor advanced, how Soviet infantry massed, how Soviet commanders exploited breakthroughs. Western planners lacked that depth of experience. The documents make clear that this option was considered a last resort, but it was considered seriously. British intelligence assessed German willingness to fight the Soviets again as high. Many former German officers viewed the Soviet Union as a civilizational enemy and feared Soviet occupation more than Allied control. That fear could be exploited, but loyalty was the central risk. The planners did not trust German forces. They feared desertion, sabotage, and political backlash. Rearming Germans could stabilize the front or destabilize everything. This uncertainty did not kill the idea. It merely confined it to the deepest level of secrecy. What makes this section even more unsettling is how closely it aligned with ideas already circulating elsewhere. Months before Operation Unthinkable was drafted, George S. Patton had privately expressed similar views. He argued that Germany, though defeated, remained the only European force capable of counterbalancing the Soviet Union. His comments were dismissed publicly as reckless. Internally, they were noted. The planners did not cite Patton. They did not need to. The logic arrived independently from the same strategic dead end. Numbers demanded solutions, and solutions demanded compromises no one wanted to own. The German question also revealed something deeper about Operation Unthinkable. This was not a plan born of confidence. It was born of fear. Fear that the war had ended on the wrong terms. Fear that moral victory had produced strategic defeat. Every reference to German manpower was accompanied by warnings. Political catastrophe. Loss of legitimacy. internal unrest. The chiefs of staff understood that even considering this option proved how desperate the situation had become. The annexes never finalized a German mobilization plan. They outlined possibilities, frameworks, risks, nothing more. That ambiguity was deliberate. If the plan ever surfaced, even decades later, plausible deniability would matter, but the fact remains. At the highest levels of British military planning, only weeks after defeating Hitler, Allied officers seriously discussed using German soldiers to fight the Soviet Union. That truth alone explains why Operation Unthinkable could never be acknowledged publicly. It also explains why the plan was never executed, because once the German question entered the equation, the moral cost of action became impossible to justify, and that led the chiefs of staff toward their final conclusion. If even victory required becoming what they had just destroyed, then perhaps the war could not be fought at all. By early June 1945, the British chiefs of staff had accumulated enough data to understand a grim truth. Operation Unthinkable was not failing because of poor imagination or lack of courage. It was failing because reality refused to bend. Every layer of analysis pointed in the same direction. The first and most decisive factor was numbers. The Red Army was not merely larger than Allied ground forces in Europe. It was overwhelmingly larger and, crucially, already in position. Soviet formations stretched from the Baltic to the Balkans in continuous depth. They did not need to deploy. They did not need to mobilize. They were already there. Western planners calculated that even if American and British forces launched a surprise attack, the Red Army could absorb initial losses and still maintain operational momentum. Soviet doctrine accepted casualties at a scale that Western political systems could not sustain. This was not ideology, it was mathematics. The second failure point was time. Operation Unthinkable assumed speed. It depended on shock, confusion, and disruption. But intelligence assessments made clear that Soviet command structures were already hardened. Years of war had conditioned them to sudden attacks, reversals, and chaos. Surprise would be limited. Recovery would be rapid. More damaging still, time favored the Soviet Union in every extended scenario. Every week of continued fighting would weaken Western resolve while strengthening Soviet leverage. Allied economies were exhausted. Britain was financially crippled. Rationing was still in place. The United States faced immense pressure to bring troops home, not commit them to a new European war. Public tolerance for sacrifice had reached its limit. Planners were brutally honest about this. They did not assume the public could be persuaded. They assumed it could not. The war against Germany had been sold as a moral necessity. A war against the Soviet Union, so soon after victory, would appear as betrayal. The third factor was political alignment. Operation Unthinkable was commissioned by Britain, but it could not be fought by Britain alone. American participation was essential, yet intelligence assessments warned that American political leadership was divided and increasingly inward-looking. The Pacific War still demanded attention. The American electorate wanted closure, not confrontation. British planners feared the most dangerous outcome of all, a war begun without full political unity. If American support wavered mid-conflict, Britain would face the Red Army alone. That scenario was considered catastrophic. The chiefs of staff refused to design a plan that depended on uncertain political will. Then came the question of escalation. Once war began, planners believed there would be no mechanism to control its expansion. Soviet counteroffensives would push west. Allied bombing would devastate Eastern Europe. Civilian casualties would skyrocket. Resistance movements would ignite across occupied territories. This would not be a contained conflict. It would be total. The use of atomic weapons was discussed, but cautiously. In mid-1945, atomic weapons were untested in combat. Their psychological and military impact was theoretical. More importantly, their political use against a former ally raised unprecedented moral and diplomatic risks. The chiefs of staff could not assume atomic dominance would end the war quickly. They treated it as an unknown, not a solution. The next failure point was logistics. Western supply chains were stretched thin across oceans. Soviet supply chains were local, rail-based, and already optimized for continental warfare. Intelligence assessments concluded that the Red Army could sustain high-intensity combat longer than Western forces operating at the end of extended lines. Fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles, every category favored the Soviet side over time. Then there was Germany. The planners understood that Europe itself was unstable. Rearming German units, even selectively, would trigger political upheaval. Resistance movements might turn hostile. Allied moral authority would collapse. Soviet propaganda would exploit the contradiction mercilessly. A war that required the participation of former Nazi soldiers could not be morally sustained, even if it could be militarily justified. Finally, there was the factor no document could quantify: risk operation. Unthinkable risked everything the Allies had just achieved. It risked unity. It risked legitimacy. It risked plunging a devastated continent back into chaos. And worst of all, it risked starting a war that could not be ended on acceptable terms. The chiefs of staff reached their conclusion with professional restraint. They did not declare the plan impossible. They declared it unacceptable. The wording mattered. Operation Unthinkable was judged unlikely to succeed militarily, unsustainable politically, and catastrophic strategically. Even a partial success would likely provoke a wider, longer war that the West was not prepared to fight. The plan was therefore shelved, not debated publicly, not rejected dramatically, simply closed. Churchill received the assessment. He did not challenge its conclusions. He understood what it meant. The window he feared was closing, and there was no safe way to keep it open. Within weeks, political change made the issue moot. Churchill lost the 1945 election. A new government took office. Demobilization accelerated. Attention shifted toward Reconstruction and the Pacific. Operation Unthinkable was quietly archived. But the fear that gave birth to it did not disappear. It merely changed shape. Operation Unthinkable did not end with a dramatic cancellation, a fiery debate, or a signed rejection. It ended the way only the most dangerous plans ever do. It vanished. Once the British chiefs of staff delivered their conclusions, the documents entered a different phase of existence. They were no longer operational tools. They became liabilities. Proof that at the moment the world celebrated peace, Western leaders had seriously contemplated initiating another global war. That reality could not survive daylight. The first step was classification. Operation Unthinkable was immediately sealed under the highest levels of British wartime secrecy. Not routine classification, not time-limited protection. This was deep archival burial. Distribution lists were narrowed. References were stripped from secondary documents. Copies were consolidated. Access was restricted even within military institutions. The goal was not merely secrecy, it was containment of memory. British officials understood that the mere existence of the plan undermined the moral narrative of World War II's ending. The public story was simple and emotionally necessary. Fascism had been defeated. Peace had returned. The alliance had triumphed. Operation Unthinkable shattered that illusion. It revealed fear, mistrust, and the fragility of victory itself. Even more dangerous was what the plan implied about intentions. If revealed, it would show that Britain, and by extension the Western Allies, had considered attacking the Soviet Union while it was still formally an ally. Soviet leadership would have seized on this instantly. It would have validated Stalin's deepest suspicions about Western duplicity. Any remaining diplomatic space would have collapsed overnight. So the plan stayed buried. Political change made burial easier. In July 1945, Winston Churchill lost the general election. A new government took power, focused on domestic recovery rather than geopolitical confrontation. Operation Unthinkable no longer had a sponsor. Without Churchill's personal urgency, there was no appetite to revisit it. Demobilization accelerated. Troops went home. Europe shifted from war footing to reconstruction. The moment passed, but the documents remained. For decades, Operation Unthinkable existed only as a classified artifact. It was not taught in staff colleges. It was not discussed in memoirs. It was not referenced in official histories. Silence became institutional. When partial declassification finally occurred decades later, it was careful and incomplete. Only selected documents were released. Context was minimized. The plan was framed as a theoretical exercise rather than an urgent contingency. Its proximity to actual execution dates was softened. Its assumptions about German manpower were often omitted from popular summaries. Even then, it received little attention. By the time historians gained access, the Cold War had already come and gone. Nuclear deterrence had reshaped strategic thinking. The idea of a conventional Allied Soviet war in 1945 felt distant, almost unreal. That distance blunted outrage. But distance should not reduce significance. Operation Unthinkable matters precisely because it reveals how narrow the margin was between peace and catastrophe. It shows that World War II did not end cleanly. It ended awkwardly, nervously, and under the shadow of another possible war. It also exposes a deeper truth about power. Alliances are temporary, interests are permanent, and victory does not guarantee security. The planners who drafted Operation Unthinkable were not warmongers. They were professionals, confronting a future they feared they could no longer shape. Their conclusions were bleak, but honest. The plan failed not because it was immoral, but because it was unwinnable. That distinction haunted post-war strategy. The fear that birthed Operation Unthinkable did not disappear. It evolved. It hardened into containment doctrines, military alliances, proxy wars, and nuclear standoffs. The Cold War did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from the realization that the next war had almost begun before the last one had even ended. Operation Unthinkable was the bridge between those worlds. A war planned, a war rejected, a war never fought, and a warning buried because the truth was too uncomfortable to confront. If you want long-form, document-driven W2 history that exposes what governments planned but never admitted, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. This channel exists to uncover the hidden files, the buried decisions, and the wars that almost happened. More classified operations, suppressed plans, and forgotten intelligence stories are coming next. History didn't just happen. It was decided, often in secret.